All right, so from 1850, you get conflict intensifying as a result of this fugitive slave law. Um, Now, we're going to talk just about a few examples, but all of the ones that I'm talking about here are in Boston. So Boston really becomes kind of the center. Well, most of the ones I'm going to talk about are in Boston, but Boston, as it was before the Revolution, becomes the center of conflict. Okay, and it is the most abolitionist city in the United States. That's why. Okay, and so you have the most resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 in Boston. So we're going to talk first about this couple, William and Ellen Craft, who escaped from Georgia to Boston. And Ellen was very light-skinned, so she could pass as a white person. So she poses as an elderly man who is like disabled, and she says that William is her servant, and so people believe her, and they're able to get up into Boston, and then they join the congregation of Theodore um, Parker, who is a very well-known pastor who welcomes fugitive slaves into his congregation and protects them, and is also armed for battle, keeps a loaded revolver on his desk in anticipation of having to defend some of the people within his congregation from capture. All right. And he is the kind of the leader of the vigilante committee, one of the vigilante committees active up here in Boston. So, they attract a lot of attention because it's like, wow, look at this interesting story, this couple who escapes disguised. And so, of course, the slave owner hears about it. So he goes up to Boston and is basically Ellen is being hid in the pastor's house, Parker's house. Her husband hides in another house. The house he's in has like barrels full of gunpowder on the porch, like they're ready for action. And the members of the vigilante committee are spread out through the city, prepared for the slave catchers coming into Boston to get the Crafts, William and Ellen, back down to Georgia. And so the slave catchers come in. They're kind of they can't find William and Ellen, of course. They're getting harassed, kind of, but there's also nothing too serious. But then the threat is, if you stay here longer, we're not going to guarantee your safety. We might attack you, the vigilante committee says. So within 5 days, the slave catchers leave without William and Ellen Craft. So example number one of the fugitive slave law being, ignored on the part of the people of Boston. And the president is Millard Fillmore, who we mentioned on Friday. He's a Whig. He's a New York Whig and a moderate New Yorker Whig. But his sympathies and his policy is to support the Southern Whigs, which means he is going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 in a big way. And he's threatening to send in federal troops to Boston. And Parker, the pastor of this church, sends a letter back saying, you know what? Great, because I'd rather rot in jail than go to hell, basically. He says, look, there's a higher law. There's God's law, which supersedes this unjust man-made law. And I have to break and defy this man-made law to uphold God's higher law. That's what Parker says, right? There's another big incident in Boston in 1851 here. And this one is with a guy named Shadrach, who was a escaped slave, who was a waiter in Boston. He was from Virginia. His owner comes up in February of 1851. He gets taken to a federal courthouse. Outside of the courthouse, the vigilante committee assembles, and they're demanding that he be released. They break into the courthouse, they rescue Shadrach, and they put him on the Underground Railroad up into Canada, and he settles in Montreal. And Parker hails this as the most noble deed done in Boston since the destruction of the tea in 1773. Okay, so making that link between the defense of liberty and the Revolution and the defense of the liberty of escaped slaves. Okay, Fillmore, the president, then orders an investigation to try to identify and root out everybody who's involved in defying the fugitive slave law. Okay. And he's also now prepared to use federal troops to enforce it. So the third incident here in Boston, this teenager, 17-year-old guy who escapes from Georgia in February of 1851, and he gets up to Boston. Thomas Sims, he also finds work as a waiter, but his owner traces him down. They put him in the courthouse. The mayor of Boston allows the federal marshals to deputize the police in the city, so they'll protect the slave owners' interests, basically. And the courthouse is sealed with a chain, and this kind of visual symbolism is really seized on by the abolitionists, who say, look at this physical chain representing the metaphorical and actual also physical chain of slavery in the South. Well, Sims is in there for 9 days in the courthouse. The vigilante committee is demanding that he have the right to testify, demanding a right to trial by jury. None of it happens. The commissioner rules in favor of the slave owner. You get 300 armed men escorting Sims out of the courthouse at 4 a.m. in the morning, taking him to the Navy shipyard. We got 250 soldiers armed, putting him on a ship back into the South. So you got federal troops now enforcing the fugitive slave law so that the Bostonians can't rout it, okay? And up until this point, the abolitionist movement had been firmly a nonviolent movement. From 1851, though, you get people within that movement saying the fugitive slave law is going to demand that people defend themselves against federal marshals. So you're going to have to use self-defense. You're going to have to use violence sometimes to protect yourself against this fugitive slave law of 1850. Frederick Douglass is one of those who's going to be advocating for self-defense. Another one is John Brown, the famous. John Brown, who really his ideas are based in self-defense. That you have a right to resist this law. You have a right to, but he's also this very intense evangelical. So he's religiously motivated as well as most of the abolitionists are. They're mostly motivated by Christianity. But Brown is a white guy. He's a wool merchant. He's from, I think he's from New York. No, he's from Massachusetts. Springfield, Massachusetts, and he organizes a self-defense group for black people called the Gileadites. Okay, all right. Now, the first place where actual violence breaks out is actually in a Quaker town in Maryland. So this is ironic because the Quakers are pacifists, right? But this Quaker town, Christiana, I believe it was called. This is September 1821. They had protected these two fugitive slaves for a little while. I don't know how long, but they had these two fugitive slaves living in the town. So the slave owner comes in September 1851. He's demanding the fugitive slaves. Two Quakers show up. They say, "Get out of here." He says no. He's got with him 3 federal marshals, some relatives. The slave owner does. The Quakers then are facing him down. So shots ring out. There's a little skirmish. In the morning, the slave owner is dead. A few other people are injured. Millard Fillmore, again, outraged, calls out the Marines. They scour the countryside, looking for anyone who might be armed to resist the fugitive slave law. They arrest 30 black men. They arrest another 12 white people. And they are all going to be indicted for not only defying the fugitive slave law, but for treason. Millard Fillmore wants to get him for treason. Well, this is all ridiculous, but in any case, the jury acquits them. What the jury does is the jury acquits the first guy of these charges, and then the federal government just drops the rest of it, okay? So you've got just a real intensification of conflict here in the aftermath of the fugitive slave law, just a few different examples of this, sort of in how it's playing out. All right. I'm going to talk really briefly in the next little bit of lecture about some of the consequences of all this intensification of conflict.